Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Ready to become better than most people at most things? Welcome to the Pat Flynn Show. Best-selling author, entrepreneur, fitness expert, and philosopher Pat Flynn teaches you how to learn and become amazing at almost everything through the concept of generalism, acquiring and stacking skills that will help you dominate in business and life. Want to get in shape? Write a book? Be a better precog division officer? Or simply launch a successful business empire? Well, sit back, relax, and listen as Pat and his guests offer digestible and entertaining insights on how to learn the skills, tactics, and strategies you need to pursue your goals and achieve the life you've always wanted.
Folks, welcome back to the Pat Flynn Show. I'm joined again by Professor Peter Koch. We are in separate locations this time, and we each just helped ourselves to an adult beverage before this deep, intricate philosophical conversation. So what is the professor having to drink?
I got a looks like a Southern Tier New School IPA.
How is it?
It should be pretty solid, actually.
Pretty decent. Yeah, I have
it's like the special at the store across the street from me. So
awesome, perfect.
What do you got?
I have a Long Trail Ale.
Nice.
It's okay so far. I won't judge it too much on the first sip. Where did this even come from? I have no idea. I think somebody brought it over to the last gathering that we had, and we have some leftovers. So it's from Vermont.
Is that a New York beer? Something like that?
It says Vermont.
Vermont.
The great state
All right.
that I've never been to of Vermont.
Cool.
So what's happening, my friend? We did a little bit of catching up, but you're deep in semester teaching. You're teaching just 2 classes a semester, right? Bioethics?
Yeah, two bioethics. Technically, I guess healthcare ethics they call it, but 2 of those. So going well. Good students.
Good.
They'll be complimented.
Yeah. So just to give people just the brief background, in case this is the first time that they've heard you on the show, even though you've been on probably like 4 or 5 times now. Who are you and what do you do?
I'm an assistant professor at Villanova University. I'm in the philosophy department and I do bioethics. So I do a lot of ethics in medicine and what it means to treat people the right way in a healthcare setting. So, and then I do some political philosophy, and I do a little bit of I dabble in quite a few things, kind of like you know.
Good. Well, yeah, maybe we can do some dabbling this episode. One thing I wanted to ask you that I never asked you before is when people meet you and you explain what you do, what are the most common questions that you get asked, or what are the most interesting ones?
Oh man,
take both. Yep.
The kind of like joke among philosophers is that if you right when you introduce yourself as a philosopher, just everything goes wild. How you just introduce yourself as an accountant and nobody has any questions, but yeah. It's also not very honest. So when I introduce myself as a philosopher, people, what they usually do is they say something about the philosophy course they took in college, whether they hated it. And then they sometimes talk about Freud and then have to be like, not psychology, philosophy.
Yeah.
And then they say like, oh, so meaning of life stuff. I'm like, yeah, pretty much. And then kind of go from there. But it actually goes all over in the spectrum. Some people get really into it. Some people get kind of not intimidated, but like, I don't feel like talking about this right now sort of thing. So
yeah, because it's one of those things that especially when people are so afraid of being sensitive in conversation that, okay, maybe I don't want to just head in that direction just yet. Let me have a few drinks first before I talk to this philosopher guy. Yeah. Okay. But for the people who will press forward or who get excited about learning that, okay, now I have some guy who studies the biggest questions about life, or at least some very hard, interesting questions in the day today. Like, you're not just some ivory tower guy. You've you've consulted on, right? Before you were at Villanova, you were consulting on hard medical cases, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So one of the reasons I do healthcare ethics, or at least I have the position that I have now, is because I spent about a year and a half in Houston, Texas, working in hospitals. So it would actually, I would be called into hospitals to discuss cases like ethical dilemmas and work with patients and families and physicians and try to help them resolve what they consider to be moral dilemmas. So I have I think it's a nice part of kind of my background and what I do is that I have, I guess you could say, ground level experience. Mm-hmm. And when I start talking about that, then people get really interested. And a lot of times they tell me stories about things that have happened to them in hospitals and experiences they've had and stuff like that. So yeah, that gets people going. If I start talking about that, I definitely, get a lot of interesting things.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Just that I try to connect, like you said, the ivory tower with what actually happens in people's lives as well as I can, but sometimes it's difficult.
So let me ask you this. In the past 3 months, 5 months, however long, but relatively recently, in your encounters with meeting new people, what have been the most interesting questions that they've asked you when they have actually been interested in talking to you?
Oh, man, that's a good question. I had a really long conversation about being with somebody because that's what I wrote my dissertation on.
On what was that, being?
Well-being.
Oh, well-being. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And basically the big puzzle is, at least what I think the most interesting puzzle is whether or not your life goes well just because you think it goes well or if it actually has to go well. Mm-hmm. You're deceived into thinking that you have a lot of great friends and a lot of your company's doing well and your spouse is faithful, but they're actually your friends are fake and your company's failing and your spouse is cheating on you with your friends. Mm-hmm. Is your life worse off? Is just being deceived, does that make your life bad? Mm-hmm. The reason it matters is because, so here's a actual situation in which it matters. We had a patient who was found unresponsive and then brought into the intensive care unit. And the patient had to have a blood transfusion. And it turned out the patient was a Jehovah's Witness. So they found out after doing the blood transfusion that she was a Jehovah's Witness, and Jehovah's Witnesses refuse blood transfusions generally. So she, when she awoke from being unconscious, there was a debate about whether or not to tell her because the fact had already happened. There's nothing you could do about it. Mm-hmm. So she said, well, I'll just continue. She was going to recover fully, but she would have died if she didn't have the blood transfusion. So she could have just continued her life without ever knowing, and her well-being would have been high, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But if we really, it's you essentially it jeopardizes your salvation in that framework. So we were do we tell her? What is the benefit of telling her? All these things. So that's a well-being question, right?
So all right. Well, we're gonna have to go in this direction now. You opened it up. I guess so first off, how do you answer that question would be the first one, and you might answer my second question by answering the first, but can that question even be answered proximately? Meaning, can that question be answered apart from the much greater metaphysical questions?
Well, I'll start with first. Can we have an answer to that question? I think so. Let me just take one step back. The reason the question, what is well-being, matters so much is because it's central to almost every ethical framework that is out there. Mm-hmm. If you're worried about anything, consequences, duties, any of these things, then somewhere along the line, you're going to have questions about well-being.
Yeah.
And I think the problem is that well-being is really two distinct things. And so when you have, for example, medicine, you have the promotion of patient well-being is a central tenet of medicine. And that gets really tricky when you have these subjective and these objective features of well-being. So I think we have to start talking about well-being with respect to the subjective and the objective, both. It's really two questions that's often treated as one. What is well-being? Well, what we really mean is how is the person's experience going for them? And also, how is their life actually going?
Yeah.
See what I'm saying?
Yeah. Oh, no, I see what you're saying. I'm just trying to figure out how quickly we can get to nihilism on this one.
Quickly.
Yeah, no.
Is an indication of the present, yeah.
So I guess here's a thought experiment, right? And say because I think a lot of it assumes, I would argue wrongly, a sort of naturalistic framework, right? But say the Jehovah's Witness is right. Say that let's put Jehovah's Witness aside because I don't want to be say that somebody ascribes to religion where if they had a medical procedure done, they would lose something significant in the hereafter, whatever that is. Maybe they would even lose the hereafter. Say that that's right. Doesn't matter if it is or not, but just imagine that that's right. Would it then be, and it seems like this is kind of what your case would be, they would be worse off having had that medical procedure, even if they thought that it increased their well-being, because the way reality is that they did something that really screwed them in the long term.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's like it's so hard in medicine because so many things are end of life. Nobody has any, there's no, there's a fact of the matter, an ontological fact about what happens after you die. Mm-hmm. Completely, irrespective of what our views are on it. But for right now, we just have to deal with the fact that many people have many views about what happens after you die. Mm-hmm. But kind of the default is that we do well-being judgments just in this life. So it's getting kind of wild already. But you see, like it's when we talk about well-being of a person, we hardly talk about how their life now will affect their, the long-term post-life plan of the way that people are.
Yeah, and that was my question was, can the well-being question really be answered without considering those greater ontological, metaphysical questions? I don't see how it could be. And if you assume naturalism, say that this is all there is, then I guess immediately somebody like me goes, well, it doesn't really matter anyways, does it?
So here's one way that we naturally talk about well-being in terms of like periods. We refer to like stretches of time usually. Mm-hmm. So if I'm like, Pat, how has your life been since, getting married, for example? I like stipulate this is the period I'm talking about. So you can talk about well-being along certain stretches and make sense of it. Mm-hmm. But, and so we could just say like, what's assumed is just like up until the point of death. Yeah. It's the same thing that natural language gives us, which is point A to point B. How are you doing across that time? Or like when I say, Pat, how was your vacation? And you're like, oh, okay. It went well at a great time. Mm-hmm. That's, 10-day stretch or something like that.
Yeah.
So you can do that. But I agree. I mean, a big part of making ethical decisions about the end of life, so much rests on whether or not people continue, in some distance or another. It's against it.
Yeah. So what does so when you were Professor Peter has got a very hungry dog and he has a moral obligation to feed that creature. Yeah. I like this. I like these talks. Maybe we'll have to make this a regular thing on Saturday afternoon. Yeah.
It's kind got a different ambience to it.
Mm-hmm.
Got the dog flipping the bowl behind me and a beer.
Mm-hmm. So this is the reason I find this really interesting is because, well, one, hard cases are always interesting too. Even if you're already set on a certain worldview, doesn't mean that hard cases are still not difficult, right?
Yes, definitely.
But if nothing else, it forces you to consider some of these greater questions. So what is what is the state of bioethicists? Like when you go to consult on a case, is it like, here's Peter coming from his Aristotelian Thomistic tradition or whatever you're in, like going to offer his opinion, and then here's some guy B coming from a completely naturalistic, like what does that look like when these hard cases are presented? Is it one guy coming in? Is it like a panel of ethicists coming in with different opinions, or what? So
ideally, the process is that one person gets a consult typically. So you one consultant who holds a pager, and then that person gets the consult. So then they respond and they gather information. But then you draw upon other people for their inputs. And sometimes if it gets like to be a really intense case, you'll go to an entire committee. So it kind of depends on the case about how many people are involved.
Got it. Mm-hmm.
But then, so one of the first things, if you're trying to show or at least establish a role of an ethics committee in a hospital, is you're like, we're not the police and we're not here to essentially impose values on people.
Mm-hmm.
The ideal and kind of theoretical role of the ethics consultant is to elicit value. So we're like, we meet with a patient or we meet with someone who makes decisions on behalf of a patient, mm-hmm. and try to figure out what values they have and then how those values translate to their current situation. But I mean, I was talking about this yesterday with a bunch of people at the university, and it sounds really nice, but like as far as people go, it's really, really hard to actually put that into practice. Like, what does that even mean to just elicit values and not introduce any of your own values? And you know what I mean?
Well, it just sounds like relativism again. We're just
and the thing is that like everyone has their stopping point about at what point they're gonna not. I don't want to use I don't want to say like not respect somebody else's values, but like everyone knows that they have their limits to what they think is like a reasonable set of values.
Yes.
So that's what I mean. I think it's an ideal, and it presumes a lot about the way people think that is probably not true. And then you also have the fact that most people have not thought about dying. So values that really correspond. Most people haven't even thought about values really in a really fundamental way. I don't want to say most people, but a lot of people who are, in a difficult position, they have not like really reflected about what they believe and how it affects their lives.
Well, I think you're right. I think most people just assume a set of values from various people, institutions, circumstances, etc. And oftentimes these values, people like walk around, it seems, with like somewhere between 10 to 15 jumbled up, often conflicting philosophies in their head at all different times.
Right.
And they can just, a lot of people seem to be able to live with that. And I've been there too. I've certainly been there as well. So I'm trying to think, like, do we want to, you guide me on this conversation, because the whole bioethic one is a little new to me. Do we want to talk more about values at this point, or do you think it would be interesting and useful to go right to some of the hard cases? I mean, the big one that I think is very glaring in instances like this would be euthanasia. Pete, my life is terrible. I've got a leg cramp. I don't want to live anymore. Put the needle in my arm.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So where do we want it? What's the best way to go about that?
I mean, we could spend a whole podcast on euthanasia. So maybe we could also spend a whole podcast on values. But I guess continuing a bit about what we were talking about values is that one of the standards you look for when you're talking to somebody about what their values are, like you pointed out, something along the lines of consistency or coherence. So if you have somebody saying they want A and also not A, then you're in a position where you're like, it's hard not to impose your own values because this person clearly does not have, can we actually pause for a second, Yates?
Yeah, no problem. So, Professor, now that Yates has been properly cared for, what were we talking about?
Well-being.
Euthanasia.
Euthanasia, yeah. Yeah, we're talking about euthanasia.
Okay, so, yeah, how do you approach that? Because that's one of those it's a hot political topic, if nothing else right now. I mean, you always see some. So, funny story, I remember as a kid, so I grew up in Michigan for a while, and remember good old Jack Kevorkian, remember him?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he was huge, and I just remember as a kid always seeing the signs up and all the. And
was he in Michigan or something?
I think he was. He must have been because it was such a big thing at the time, and I was little, so I didn't quite understand what was going on. But looking back, I just see that as sort of interesting because I was kind of like, it was a huge thing. It must have been because everybody was staking their opinions on it. It was just picket signs everywhere, and
oh yeah, it's a big thing.
And so obviously it's still a big thing. So yeah, how does one approach this as a bioethicist? And again, not that all of them approach it the same way, but how do you approach it?
I mean, I can give you the landscape of the arguments, really.
Yeah, why not? It should be fun. It should be interesting.
So you have. Can you hear Yates?
Nah, he's all right.
Okay. So you have essentially. You got to be able to hear that, right?
That time I heard him. I get it. He's excited.
Yeah. Okay, so the it's kind of like within two frameworks. One is medical profession, whether or not physicians should participate in patients dying.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other is the broader question of whether or not suicide is permissible.
Yeah. Let's go broad, I think, because that's the more important one.
Yeah. I mean, that Camus called that the fundamental philosophical question, at least fundamental ethical question, is whether or not it's permissible to kill yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say there are essentially two opposing views. If you to give a kind of snapshot of each side.
Mm-hmm.
On one hand, which is very Western autonomy centered, kind of classic one is I have a right to my life and I have a right to my death.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty straightforward. If there's anything I should be able to control and that is mine, it's my body and my life.
Mm-hmm. And
that's in favor of suicide one.
Yep.
The other side is that you may, some things about your life are definitely up to you, but there's one thing about your life that is not up to you, and that's your value.
Mm-hmm.
You're worth something, whether or not you think you are worth it, whether or not other people think you're worth it, it's independent of all other considerations like that.
Yeah.
So when you kill yourself, you're destroying something of value. It's not up to you.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the two. I would say those are the two fundamental views.
And these are just specific instances, I think, of the same greater question of
value and nihilism.
Well, yeah, is there such thing as an objective realm of moral norms or not?
Yeah.
And that's it. So it really just kind of brings you all the way back. I don't see how you could separate these things out. Is there some type of objective dignity or value, purpose, and meaning to human life, or isn't there? If there isn't, then you don't, so far as I can tell, have a right to anything. So those arguments fail on the other side, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think a really interesting way to put it that some philosophers have argued is that if you didn't matter in the first place, the things that you care about would matter.
Mm-hmm.
So your interests only matter because you matter in the first place. So if you're interested in dying, that presumes that we care about your interests because you already matter.
Mm-hmm.
And if you already matter, and if you do matter, then we shouldn't be destroying something that matters.
Yeah, that's an interesting approach. It sort of reduces the position to incoherency on the other side, doesn't it? Yeah.
It's like saying it's saying all in one. So if I say I want to die,
mm-hmm.
and you better listen to me because I want to die, I'm saying on one hand, listen to me because I'm valuable, and on the other hand, allow me to destroy myself despite the fact that I'm valuable.
Yeah, I haven't heard that one before. That is interesting. That is interesting, indeed.
Actually, I thought you would like this one.
That one that you just did? Yeah, no, I do like that one a lot.
It's a good one.
So, yeah, I mean, that's why the euthanasia thing is so interesting to me, because it sort of presses people to consider these greater metaphysical questions. Are human beings objectively morally valuable? Do they have some type of purpose and meaning? Or are we just a cosmic accident, floating around in some infinitesimal speck of dust, utterly insignificant? Because if that's the case, then yeah, I guess it doesn't matter what you do, but nothing matters. There we go. We finally got to nihilism. We did it.
What's the clock running right now?
Yeah, 20 minutes in.
So go and this. So I think this ties in nicely. One of the fundamental philosophical puzzles about suicide and about euthanasia in particular. So euthanasia is it's like, by definition, it has to be death for benefit. It's a good death.
Mm-hmm.
Translates as good death from Greek. So people who pursue euthanasia, they're pursuing death as a benefit.
Mm-hmm.
And this introduces what I think is a super interesting kind of classic philosophical puzzle about how death can be a benefit at all, if your death is the end of your existence. So start from the assumption that some people make, that your death is the end of you,
mm-hmm.
genuinely the end of you.
Yep.
And then you add in the second premise, which is death is beneficial. You're left with the question of, to whom is it beneficial?
Yeah, who's it benefiting?
Exactly. And this is the logical problem of euthanasia.
Now, if somebody finds you really annoying,
yeah, you might benefit some.
But if you have objective moral worth, it doesn't matter how annoying people find you. You're still valuable.
Yeah. I mean, and this is like, I think this is one of the things where you can really kind of, people are interested in thinking about this question of philosophy, which is, upon what does your worth rely?
Mm-hmm.
Because if it relied on you, then when you're having a bad day and you feel worthless, your worth would actually drop to the level you think it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's ridiculous. It can't. If it relied on other people, then you have like the classic hermit problem. What if there are no other people? And you also have just the thing of, that means that minorities who are seen as worth less than other people are actually worth less because of the way they're perceived. But that sounds ridiculous too.
Yep.
So where does your worth lie?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you want to answer that one?
Dignity. Yeah. Intrinsic value.
Yeah. It's, so I think most people, right. And you would know better than I, since you're more in this field, but I mean, most people, this is a basic intuition. Like they get it. Like if somebody is having a bad day and they think that they're going to just off themselves, I'm going to jump. Everybody's intuition is, no, don't, you're worth it. Yeah, you're worth it. So I think most people get that. They do, that there's that, just like, we intuit that there is some type of objective realm of moral values and duties, even if we're not perfect in discerning what they are all the time. We get that some things are definitely right and other things are definitely wrong. Mm-hmm. But then where it gets muddy, right, is those hard cases.
Yes.
Right? Those hard cases. So how do you deal with those? I mean, think of what's the classic one, the Terry Schlabo case, right?
Yeah, Terry Shallow, yeah.
So do you, I don't know if you've done much on that or have much to say about that, or if that's a good example to begin with, or if you have a better one.
So, I mean, we can kind of I'll give you more canonical examples that they just apply all over.
Sure.
You just have the person who's been in and out of hospitals for the last 6 or 7 years. They're in their, they're elderly, say they're in their 80s, and they can go through another round of treatment, but they're like, it's just not worth it to me.
Mm-hmm.
And they're competent. They have decision-making capacity. They can make decisions, and they just are tired of life.
Mm-hmm.
These I think are the tricky ones, because you have, with Terry Schiavo, there is some like uncertainty about the what was going on medically, and wishes and stuff like that. But
yeah,
the ones that happen a lot. How do we deal with that? The autonomy people want to say that's their life, that's their death. Let them do what they will. And the value people are like, you're actually making a claim about other people in the same position.
So my first question there would be, how do you differentiate, if you do differentiate, between somebody who is, say, terminal? I mean, like, look, we're all terminal in some sense, right? But they're terminal in the way most people think about it. Somebody who's terminal, accepting their death and, say, refusing treatment, how do you differentiate between that, if you do, versus somebody who is actively seeking assisted suicide?
Sometimes so let's go to the terminal question. If you look at the legislation on physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, I think right now 8 states in the U.S. that permit or don't criminalize physician-assisted suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And then like Belgium, Netherlands, Switzerland, a handful of other countries permit it. Belgium and Netherlands are like the kind of the front runners on this. They're moving towards, if they haven't already, they have already gotten there, towards like euthanasia for infants, etc.
I saw that. So I saw like the sensationalist headlines of it. I didn't look too much into it, but there's some validity there. They're really like,
oh yeah.
Wow.
They do infant, and I should look into it, but there's below a certain age, above 12, I want to say below 2, I think, and above 12, they allow euthanasia, but that 2 to 12-year range, they don't permit it, which is interesting. So there's some debate about that right now. But so with the cases of the elderly who just think their life is not worth living,
mm-hmm.
One of the implications of that is when you say your own life is not worth living, you're making a comment about other people in similar positions, about the value of their life too.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not restricted just to your own case, which I think is interesting. So take it to the case of somebody with a disability, and you're like, oh, now I have this disability. When you say my life is not worth living because of this disability,
mm-hmm.
claiming that other people's lives with that disability.
Yeah. So say I got diagnosed with MS, and as soon as that happens, I say, you know what, it's not worth it anymore.
Yeah.
Call Dr. Jack. Well, he's not around anymore, but you know.
Is he gone, by the way?
I'm pretty sure he passed away a few years ago.
Did he choose the natural?
You know what? I honestly don't know. I'm going to have to do like a quick Google here, but Jack Kevorkian. Let's see. Yeah,
some music there.
Yeah, it's just my iPhone's freaking out. But what else is new? Jack Nicholson, not that. He's still around. I know Jack Nicholson's still around.
Yeah, he's still going.
Is he? Yeah, 2011 he passed away. I remember because HBO did a movie with him with Al Pacino played Jack Kevorkian. I actually liked the movie. I did like the movie. But anyway, so back to the main point here. So I guess let's just draw it out this way then. say that somebody's elderly, they're whatever, in their mid-80s, they're terminal, they know they're going to go. They know, maybe they could extend their life. Doctor says, yeah, maybe if we do this treatment, you could extend your life by 12 months. Like, at best, that's it. And they say, you know what, doc, I've had a good run. I don't feel my life is worthless or valueless or not worth living, but I'm just accepting it. And whatever happens at this point, I just don't want to go through that treatment. Right. Do you consider that the same type of situation?
No, I think that's different because, I mean, the end, all humans die. I mean, we just have to, there's a better and worse way to die. Mm-hmm. And it's a dignified thing to embrace the end of life in a way that means, you know, on the one hand, that's why we have this sort of extraordinary versus ordinary distinction about what sort of burdens we are, we can undertake in order to preserve our lives. Mm-hmm. Die, every one of us. And so if we start to have people be forced to have these overly burdensome things, like say somebody's going for a 4th round of chemo, mm-hmm.
and they're 97 years old,
and they're 97. That's too much. It's not required morally. Mm-hmm. Reason is because it's considered something that the burden of it outweighs the potential benefit. Mm-hmm. It's not a claim about your worth as a person. In fact, it's because of your worth as a person that you don't have to go through those things. Mm-hmm.
So then let's take, because that's sort of the opposite, right? Is that like people, and this is often a mischaracterization, if not a straw man. It's like, oh, you know, you people just would do anything to keep somebody alive no matter what. And that's not necessarily the case, is it? It's like,
no, not at all. Yeah.
There's certainly nothing wrong with, and I had a grandparent like that. It was old, definitely old. Like, you know, could maybe possibly have extended his life by going through a bunch of arduous various treatments, but decided, you know what, I've had a good run. I've made peace with it. I'm accepting it, and I'm good. And exactly. and everybody was fine with that in the family. And, you know, nobody had an issue with that. That felt like the right thing to do. There was nothing like intuitively bothering about that, but there's something that's very intuitively bothering about a 15-year-old who says, I'm having a bad day. I think it's time to end it all.
Yes, exactly. And like you say, we intuitively can make that distinction. So then once you make the distinction, the questions are why. And towards the end of life, people a natural arc to the way that we live and the way that we die. And disease will take its toll. And sorry, one second.
It's all good, man. I have my kids yell it down at the bottom of the stairs too. Yeah. I'm not sure if you can hear them or not. Somebody must have let them out of their cages.
Yeah. So I mean, you can make the distinction intuitively, and then when you flesh out what that actually, like, what is the basis for intuitions, if there's such a thing as a basis for intuitions, you kind of get the feeling that. At the end of life, there's death, which we should embrace, and that's okay. It's embracing death and not bringing death. That's the distinction.
All right, so maybe we should now pivot, because we've considered some of the specifics to the questions about values, and because as an ethicist, you said you kind of work within people's, I guess, framework of values, but first off, do you agree with that approach? Do you feel it's appropriate to impose values as an ethicist, or what's the deal there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, because on the one hand, an ethics consultant, if there's anybody who has expertise in values, it should be somebody who studies values and thinks about values all day, every day. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, there's a sort of liberal framework of you allow people with, and you usually have this criterion of either rationality or consistency or coherence, something along those lines, to live their life according to their own values, as long as these values are connected in the right way.
So yeah, like why the relativism until the objectivism? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think that's why I know that like a lot of people might say that they're relativists on paper, but when it really comes down to it, it's not just any value goes, and people in practice live like that, not it goes. So you could say, you know, and I think you would, you know, the reason that we both find that nihilism versus value laden thing so interesting is because you have to take a turn somewhere and make some commitment somewhere.
That's the, I guess, the problem that I've had, and I'm willing to be convinced, but I do not see how relativism does not actually ultimately collapse into nihilism. I just don't see how that doesn't happen unless you're actually a moral realist pretending to be a relativist, which I think is the case for most people. Because I mean, you know, like let's take an example, right? Well, I like to play video games for 12 hours a day and, you know, just indulge and snack around on Fritos and stuff like that. Be like, hey, you know, that's cool. That's his value, right? Oh, but I also like to go around and, you know, I don't even know what barbaric crime I want to mention at this point, right? Yeah. But whatever that terrible thing is, you know, engage in like, you know, go on some type of homicidal spree every other Tuesday. Well, suddenly you've got a problem with my values and a real big problem with my values. So why is it then that you draw the line there versus just a video game thing? And it seems like if you're willing to draw the line somewhere, we should start to think more critically about values all the way through and ask, okay, if it's wrong for him to do at least one thing, which is go around and act like Jeffrey Dahmer on the weekends, is it really morally neutral? Does it really not matter at all if he just treats himself poorly, both in terms of health and say developing moral character and virtues and stuff like that? I guess that's the thing that has always gotten me about these relativists.
Well, I think part of it is it's worth saying like how we deal with other people politically. I don't mean like politically in like the political party sense. I mean like what calls for intervention and what doesn't. Mm-hmm. And so that's where relativism, I think, makes the most sense. And like, okay, maybe you do believe that. Maybe you think like lying when your friend asks you if you like their new shirt, you know, and you're like, yeah, it looks great, even though you don't like it. and you're like, okay, I think lying is wrong, and you think lying is right in that case because, you know, we have different views about lying. But I'm not going to like jump up and intervene when you tell your friend that you like their shirt. So it's like relativism in that sense. Mm-hmm. We disagree about values, but there's some sort of consensus about when we impose our own values on other people. Mm-hmm. So I think that's kind of what the framework is for an ethics consultant along those lines. Like even if I disagree with you, I value your right to be wrong.
Yeah, I know that was one of the kind of the famous things where people would say often in terms of, and this was actually, I think, had to do with theocracy for a while, where people were like, well, you know, who says that error has a right? Right. But then the counter argument is that, okay, error doesn't have a right, but people have a right, and erroneous people still have rights. I think is probably part of what you're getting at there. And I think that that's certainly right and true. I don't think that like everything that, you know, the most ardent moral realist, virtue ethicist, natural law person can think of should be legally enforced. I think that would be totally utterly impossible and probably insane. But
even like interactions with other people, that's what I'm saying. Like the legality is really high level. You know? Mm-hmm. That's how you stop the Jeffrey Dahmers. But just like in dealing with people in, say, a family meeting at a hospital, mm-hmm. At what point do we make and this gets back to your earlier question about like what does it mean to make recommendations about value to other people, you mm-hmm. know? So that it's kind of, but you were saying along those lines, something.
Yeah, and I know that even Aquinas said that, right? Like he I think he even made an argument, right, that he wasn't even sure if prostitution should be outlawed.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Obviously he thought it was wrong and that people shouldn't engage in it. But I'm fairly certain it was Aquinas who said that it for various reasons it shouldn't be outlawed. So I mean, I guess they're not entirely separate, legality and morality. And we had this talk before with Sam before.
Yeah.
Obviously inform each other, and then that will play a role in the biomedical world for sure. So there's a question for you. Is like, how tightly should morality and legality be entwined?
I'm actually working on something right now about that, which is the general idea that I think is I'm kind of working through. I was talking with some people about it a couple of days ago, but that if anybody in a hospital has an obligation to break the law, it's an ethics consultant, because essentially their contribution is aimed at moral goods and not legal goods. So their role in the hospital is exactly that, to not give as much weight to legal and institutional frameworks and rather moral. But then you get into the issues about which moral framework are we going by,
Oh, I know which one. Well, it's one of those philosophy 101 questions that just like blows everyone's mind, right? When they ask like the kids, what's the difference between morality and legality? And they've never thought of it really before.
Yeah.
Moral, because they've just assumed that it's one and the same, but they're obviously not, at least not always one and the same. Something can be legal and immoral. Something can be immoral and perfectly legal. But I just remember sitting in that 101 philosophy class when the professor brought that up, and just everybody was like, they were amazed. They were so amazed that this question was being brought up. But it is an important question, and it is.
If I ask somebody, say you take like a contentious bioethics issue, and you say, okay, give me an argument, give me what you think the strongest argument in support of and against is. And a good handful will say the reason that it's permissible or not permissible, whatever the issue is because it's legal or not legal. But I'm like, a completely independent issue, that doesn't have the morality of it. It's exactly what you're saying. But people do confuse it all the time. They think that legal reasons are moral reasons, but they're not.
So when we're talking about various moral frameworks, what are the most popular proposals that you will typically I know which one you would propose. What are some of the ones? Well, yeah, let's go with the one that you propose, and then some of the ones that you will quarrel with or contend with. What's pervading? What's the various moral thoughts that are pervading bioethics these days?
Right now, so an autonomy-based view of autonomy-based ethical framework is number one in bio. The pendulum's kind of swinging more towards away from autonomy, more towards like it's kind of difficult to say, but person-centered or dignity-centered.
It's interesting.
Yeah, it's heading that way. Because
what do you think is causing that swing?
On the one hand, it's just kind of the natural way things go, is that like back and forth. So essentially in the 70s, 80s, there's that really like autonomy kind of cultural political shift. Mm-hmm. And so everything became like patient-centered, patients know their own values, et cetera, and then left the patients. And so it went really, really far to where it was like patients are essentially controlling medicine. And then it became so extreme that people are like responding. So you just have a reaction to something.
Yeah, that makes sense. We've seen,
and then it's going back the other way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so the opposite of I guess like an autonomy centered thing is like a more paternalistic centered, framework, which is doctors know what's best for patients. And so doctors, if there's any context in which somebody is permitted to impose their values, it's in that sort of context in medicine. So that's where it's going now.
So that's interesting, because a doctor might know best for what will save your life in a certain situation, but they won't be able to tell of whether that's the appropriate way to do so, morally, or whether your life should be saved in the first place.
Yeah, no, exactly. So that's why, it's one interesting question is dividing up the sorts of choices that you have when you're in a situation of needing medical treatment, and then figuring out who would be the expert in those. So medically, like health related, obviously a doctor. Values and your own well-being, people will automatically say the patient, but it's not necessarily true that patients are the best judge of their own well-being.
Yeah,
studies about that.
Yeah, just think of, we talked about this before. Just in fact, our friendship started off with the question, you asked me whether I thought people had a moral obligation to try and be fit.
Yeah, exactly.
And if they do, certainly a lot of people aren't following through on that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I hear you.
So,
and fitness is a great example of, are people well equipped to know what it means to be fit and how to get there? Yeah. It doesn't seem like there's a reason we have people to turn to for advice and direction,
But it's part of that, it's that question of values. And part of the duty, if there is a duty to educate, right, which I think there is, especially in the family unit, part of the parent's duty, part of the moral obligation is not only to protect your kids, but to educate them. And part of the education should include values. Mm-hmm. I don't think we're seeing that very often anymore either. And it's part of this deep moral confusion that's going on. So I'm trying to think of which direction or which note to end this on when it comes to because to me it's like you can kind of wait around in the particulars here in the specific instances, but at some point you have to kind of draw it out and be like, okay, if human beings have a value, which most of us intuit, if they have some type of purpose, well, we can't just stop there. I guess we could use that for a general framework, but it's not going to be that helpful when things start getting more specific and even more difficult. I think we have to inquire, well, where do they get their value from, and what is the purpose exactly? So what do you make of that?
I think it's a great point. It's so the very nature. One of the problems is that the very nature of intrinsic value, the value that you have, is that it's not valuable for anything else. So you can never ask, well, why is that valuable, and then have an answer. It's just like a stopping point in value. Mm-hmm. So when people want to say, well, let me just contrast it to instrumental value, which is valuable for something else. So why is a car valuable? A car is valuable because it gets you around. Why is it valuable? Because it makes your life better. Why is a good life valuable? Well, I don't know, So you get to a point where you can no longer answer why something's valuable, and that's what we call intrinsic value. Mm-hmm. So when people are like, well, why are human beings valuable? Well, it's sort of a point that you just have to go one direction or the other. You either have to reject it or embrace the value of human beings. And maybe it's not human beings in themselves. Maybe it's rational natures. Maybe it's being created in the image of God, but you have to make some sort of choice there.
Yeah. For me, I think it's a pretty stark divide. For me, I think once you get to that question, it either becomes a theological question, or you have to accept the pit of nihilism.
Are you happy that we made it there?
I just don't. And I've pressed so many people on this issue, philosophers as well, like moral intuitionists, recently in a Facebook group, I got into it big with a moral intuitionist, right? And who makes all these intuition-based arguments. I'm like, well, what the heck is the intuition pointed at? Like, you can't just keep it an intuition. It has to be grounded in something. And I agree with your intuition, Mr. Intuitionist, but we need more than that. Is this intuition an illusion, or is it aiming at something, perceiving something that really exists? That's the most fundamental question, because if it's an illusion, then it isn't real by definition. Then we don't actually have value. But if it is a drawn illusion, then I would say we have some type of obligation to go a little bit deeper, either philosophically or theologically, to figure these things out. But we can't just keep arbitrarily drawing the line here and just be like, that's it. Humans have value, but at least I can't. I got to know why.
Yeah, I mean, no, I agree, and I think that's. I think it is, and we usually end up at something about nihilism in most of the podcasts, but I think it is a fundamental question that people just have to address, and it is a commitment. That's why, I mean, there's so many. A lot of times, people are like, "Oh, you're a Catholic and a philosopher. Like, how does that work?" But if you're,
well, it means I'm the best.
But if you're a philosopher, like, you know that there are some things that you just have to, there are starting points that you just have to work from and have to make assumptions about. And it's the same as religion.
Yeah, it was one of those things, and that's why I appreciate people like Aquinas so much. Is, philosophy was a tool to ultimately serve theology, and I think that's fundamentally right. And I think that it is sure, it's useful as a tool in a sense that it can get us a long ways by just assuming that human beings have intrinsic worth, but it can't get us all the way, and it becomes especially difficult when the questions get more difficult, right?
Yeah.
Especially the hard cases, like the case of the Jehovah's Witness person or any religious person, and considering the actual ontology of human beings. What are we? Like, is there something after this life? Because if there is, it could be what we do here could quite significantly affect what we do after. Not definitely, but it might. The possibility is there. So those are things we all need to consider. So I don't know, man, but I mean, I'm guessing that all of that stuff is probably pretty taboo to some extent. Is it, or is it not?
Not really. I mean, it's in the circles of, I guess, people who are in clinical ethics in like a research component rather than like a strictly consultative component. These are the things that you definitely talk about. I mean, most people in the world are religious. So when you're in a hospital, a lot of times the presumption is that these people have some sort of faith-based.
Yeah, because you're not in the sort of in the arbitrary bounds of academia anymore. You're back in real life.
Yeah, you're dealing with real people and real situations and stuff like that. So you're confronted with all these different worldviews, and not even religion, but also, for some people, the whole family makes a decision and not the individual. Or some people don't want to hear about their disease and they only want their family to hear about it. So tons of different cultures and different norms that play a role. So I think clinical ethics and bioethics is interesting because it really incorporates, I mean, bioethics arguably was founded in, a Catholic foundation. So it incorporates naturally different religions and different cultures and all these things, and like confronts them head on. So,
yeah, absolutely fascinating. So I think that maybe we can take the jump from philosophy to theology in the next episode.
Yeah, we can do whatever you want.
That's good. I mean, I mean, we've covered we've certainly dabbled, my friend, as we promised we would.
We have dabbled.
Is there anything else you think that we're missing, or that is worth thinking about for people who might not have considered these things before?
I mean, I think my big question would be, or the big take home message is that question of worth. Why are people worth anything if they are worth something? And then from there, that's where ethics comes from, that question, I think.
Perfect. Well, think about it, my friends. And as always, thank you, Professor Koch, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. We'll do this. Well, hopefully in person again next time. Always enjoy those sessions.
Yeah. Definitely.
We'll get a little party going down on campus again or something like that.
Yeah.
And
Saturday bad though.
Yeah.
Gates is pretty.
He's good.
Pretty distracting.
Good company.
It's all right. Yeah.
But folks, be sure to rank, subscribe, send this podcast to both of your friends, and we will catch you next time. Folks, before you go, I want to tell you very quickly about my new book, How to Be Better at Almost Everything, and all of the really cool bonuses we are giving away to anybody who pre-orders a copy, or 10 copies, or 1,000 copies, or 1 million copies. Look, if you pre-order 1 million copies of my book, you and me, we're going out for a really nice dinner. Now, I get to pick the place because I'm a little picky about what I eat, but I promise it will be worth it. Anyway, in perhaps more seriousness, the book is about generalism, or how to get good to great at many different things and then combine skills to find competitive and creative advantages in life. It's everything that this podcast has culminated in. And to celebrate the initial pre-launch of the book, we are giving away some really cool, really interesting stuff. Fitness challenges, nutrition plans, workout programs, and we have a lot of great stuff for business owners as well. If you're interested in growing an online platform, building an email list, gathering a social media following, just really awesome supplementary material that I think is going to be of great interest to anybody who listens to this show. So not only do I think you'll love the book, but I want you to take advantage of all this great stuff we're giving away while the book is available for pre-order. So just head over to howtobebetterbook.com. That's howtobebetterbook.com and check it out.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.